Welcome back to Women of Hollywoodland, the podcast that explores the feminist dawn of Hollywood. This is episode number 6, and we're talking about screenwriter, author, and playwright Anita Loos. Firstly, though, huge thank yous to Tuna Bake, Kim Indie Author, and the Glamour Girls for this week's sharing and reviewing. It really is appreciated. Thank you so much. So Anita Loos wrote over 200 screenplays during a career that spanned decades, and her stories have made stars out of Douglas Fairbanks, Jean Harlow, and Audrey Hepburn, to name a few. As Carrie Beecham puts it in Anita Loos Rediscovered, Anita began writing for the movies when they were still shown in Nickelodeons in between vaudeville acts. She was still working when Cinerama was introduced. Historian Kevin Brownlow calls her the most celebrated of the early scenario writers, and she's credited with turning title cards into an art form, or as her biographer Gary Carey puts it, a legitimate form of screen humour. You see, until Anita Loos came along, title cards just really did the work that today would be in the slugline of a screenplay. They established that we were in so-and-so's house and it was now nighttime. But it was Anita Loos that started putting kind of funny little asides and commentary into them, essentially the ancestor of dialogue. In 1917, director G.W. Griffith told Photoplay magazine, "The most important service that Anita Loos has so far rendered on the screen is the elevation of the subcaption first to sanity and then to dignity and brilliance combined." In fact, in many ways, it could be argued that as a silent film screenwriter, Anita Loos was wasted, or at least ahead of her time. Many of the first few stories that Biograph bought from her proved to be unfilmable because so much of the comedy and wit was in the words themselves. Still, it hardly held her back. She became the very first staff writer in Hollywood when Griffith put her on salary for the Triangle Film Corporation in 1915 for $75 a week. She was also a novelist, of course, a playwright, a columnist, and quite a complicated personality. In fact, I struggle a wee bit to get a handle on what she was really like. See, on the one hand, she comes across like a total flapper through and through. She was famed for her fashion, her glamorous lifestyle. She once said, "I've had my best times when trailing a Mainbocker evening gown across a sawdust floor. I've always loved high style and low company." She and her husband, John Emerson, once blagged their way into a suite at the Savoy, which belonged to some lord or other who was away in Scotland after they arrived in London without hotel reservations. And her niece Mary Anita once described her arrival back in Hollywood after The Gentlemen Prefer Blondes became a hit. "I will never forget how elegant she looked, stepping out with all her fancy French Vuitton luggage and her fancy new husband, John Emerson. There waiting for them was a tremendous limousine complete with 2 crystal vases for orchids at each side of the back seats and a very elegant liveried chauffeur." She was friends with Dorothy Parker and a kind of fringe member of the famed New York Round Table set. Friends too with Cecil Beaton and H.L. Mencken, whose penchant for, quote, witless blondes inspired her famous novel. Her obituary in the New York Times stated, "Until her eyesight and hearing began to fail last year, she died in 1981 at the age of 93, Miss Loos was an assiduous partygoer and diner out, conspicuous at fashion shows, theatrical and movie events, balls and galas. She lived on West 57th Street across from Carnegie Hall and virtually had been a New York social institution." And yet, for all that, I can't help but thinking that she was a bit of a wee soul as well. For one thing, there's the rotten irony that the creator of the original gold digger Lorelei Lee was married to a freeloading jerk who threw fits of hypochondria whenever she was getting too much attention. Then there's the fact that her niece Mary Anita remembers her aunt admitting that when she was alone in a city, she would write things like "go to library" in her diary so she could tell herself she was busy. It almost makes me think a little bit about the famous F. Scott Fitzgerald quotation that hedonism is despair turned inside out. Anita Loos was famed for her wit on screen and off it too. In 1916, Photoplay magazine labelled her the soubrette of satire. She described the famed Algonquin hotel set as having IQs as high as their talk was rowdy, and once Riley described her work writing for Douglas Fairbanks as finding the widest variety of places from which he could jump. There was a healthy dose of bitchiness in her wit as well. When bored by Zelda Fitzgerald's shocking antics at yet another wild party, Anita commented that her face was extraordinary, but she really should have kept her bosom under wraps. And yet, when Carl Brown, who worked with Anita on the Griffith lot, asked her once how she was so fast on the comeback, she replied, "As long as I can hang on to my copy of Voltaire, nobody's going to catch me without a snappy comeback." Carrie Beecham's theory is that her bon mots were her armour, yet by not accepting credit for her wit, she felt safe in the knowledge that if the gag backfired, she had Voltaire to blame. And yeah, I kind of agree. Anita Loos seems certainly determined to play down her talent and her every achievement. In fact, in a lot of ways, she seems to me to really sum up the spirit of the 20s, in particular the conflict between image and substance that was at the heart of the flapper generation. It's this sort of all that glitters is actually pretty gold, but pretends not to be because that would be taking life too seriously. I'm going to get back to that in a minute, but first of all, let's fill in a little bit of background. Corinne Anita Loos was born on the 26th of April 1889 in Etna, California. She was the middle of 3 children. Her older brother Clifford became a doctor, and sadly her younger sister Gladys died of appendicitis at the age of 8. Her father seems to have been one of those dreamers whose heart was in the right place, but kind of verged on feckless when it came to supporting a family, though they seem to have been fairly close. The family moved first to San Francisco when Anita was about 4, and then on to San Diego as his various professions and business ventures dictated. Her dad also seems to have had a little bit of an eye for the ladies. In Anita Loos Rediscovered, Carrie Beecham recounts the story of a wistful beauty who came calling one day when Anita and her mother were home alone. The woman announced that the purpose of her visit was to ask Minnie, that was Anita's mother, to divorce her husband so that he would be free to marry her. Minnie graciously invited the woman in for tea and calmly informed the visitor that she was hardly the first to make that request, and since her husband had yet to ask her for a divorce, he would not be getting one. Anita once said that she knew she wanted to be a writer from the age of 8, and it appears that she began to make a living at it not very long afterwards. The actress Louise Brooks described her in an interview to Kevin Brownlow in the 60s. She's a brilliant woman. Do you know what she was doing when she was 15? She was writing 3 scripts a week for Griffith. She had 2 vaudeville acts playing in Top Vaudeville, and she was writing a Broadway column for a New York paper, and she'd never been out of California. It does seem that at some point in her early teens, Anita Loos began to be fascinated with this brand new medium of the movies. I saw them all, she said, and it occurred to me that they must need stories, so I wrote one. It was inspired by Mary Pickford. I mailed it in, and it was accepted immediately. The title was The New York Hat. Mary Pickford played the lead, and D.W. Griffith directed. I got $25. I was 12 years old. But Carrie Beecham points out in Without Lying Down that The New York Hat was in fact the 3rd screenplay she sold. And a little maths tells us that if she was born in 1889, she wasn't 12 in 1912. But Anita was often quoted as saying that she would never let facts get in the way of a good story. Either way, from around 1912, the Biograph Company was regularly buying film scenarios from her on a freelance basis. One source suggests that she sold around 105 scenarios over a 2-year period. So she was a woman with a successful career, yet one of her early films, released in 1913, was actually an anti-suffrage satire called A Cure for Suffragettes. It starred Dorothy Gish, and a 1919 review of it, this was in an anti-suffrage magazine, read, "To a regular female woman, it will appear as a masterpiece of anti-suffrage wit and humour. Nobody but a hide-bound suffragette in pinched shoes could possibly object to the picture." A couple of years later, Frank Doherty invited Anita to become staff writer for Biograph in Los Angeles, but her mother forbade her, fearing for her daughter's reputation if she lived alone in LA at such a young age. Ever the pragmatist, Anita, in her own words, began to plot her escape by an archaic method that belonged back in the generation of my poor helpless mother, i.e. she got married. She later claimed that the marriage lasted just a night before she pretty much snuck out the window and headed for Hollywood, but other sources suggest that she was married for around 6 months before she took off. Now, by this point, it's 1915 by now, Griffith had formed the Triangle Film Corporation with Thomas Ince and Max Sennett, and he signed Anita on as a staff writer. One of her first assignments was to write the titles for his epic feature and follow-up to Birth of a Nation, Intolerance. And again, we see this frustrating anti-feminism coming from a working woman. One of the most famous intertitles in Intolerance reads, "When women cease to attract men, they often turn to reform as a second option." Witty maybe, but not exactly the sisterhood. She later said of her early years in Hollywood, "I would sit in on set during rehearsals, and if one particular actor showed special talent, I could put something in for him. It was all very easy in those days. We had so much fun that I don't really remember when the work got done." And quotes like that make me want to jump through time and punch her. Anita Loos got up at 5 a.m. for most of her adult life to write and famously laboured over every last word, and yet time and time again we hear her pretending that she just dashed stories off quickly without thinking about something else. So not long after Intolerance's release, Anita became the main writer for rising star Douglas Fairbanks. Despite apparently doing no work, she wrote 5 smash hits in a row for Douglas Fairbanks, which solidified his reputation as a swashbuckling action star. In 1918, she and director John Emerson were offered a 4-picture deal by Famous Players Lasky's in New York, so they headed east. Anita was hopelessly in love with Emerson at this point, even though he was quoted as saying that he had never been nor could be faithful to any one female. And Anita consoled herself that beauties were around every corner, but a brain that could support him was once in a lifetime encounter. She and Loos married not long after their arrival in New York, and they collaborated to release 2 of the very first movie industry know-how books, Breaking Into the Movies, published in 1919, followed by How to Write Photoplays in 1921. And it's here that we come across yet another contradiction. Despite her apparent subservience to Emerson in a lot of their life, Anita Loos didn't take his name. She even joined a society that fought for women's rights to keep their own surnames. So she'll make fun of the fight for the vote, and she would share screen credits with him when everyone knew that he did nothing, yet objected to being known as Mrs. Emerson. It's so weird. Now, the Famous Players Lasky's films weren't quite the smash hits that she'd written for Fairbanks back in California, and a play, The Whole Town's Talking, only seems to have been a moderate success. Luckily then, in 1925, Anita was on a train when, according to her niece Mary Anita, she began to think about the fact that blondes seemed to attract so much more attention than brunettes. She was devoted to the witty author H.L. Mencken, who, at the time, was interested in a young blonde. Anita suddenly realised that though this girl was her age, and although she was just as pretty and a great deal smarter, somehow or other the blonde attracted more attention and eventually ended up with more diamonds than her brunette counterparts. In the long train hours from New York to Hollywood, she wrote the nucleus of what was to become Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Now, if you've only seen the 1957 film with Marilyn Monroe, I really urge you to seek out a copy of Anita's book. The Monroe film is fun and frothy, and apparently Anita really enjoyed it, but it just doesn't grasp the biting satire of the novel that truly makes it an American classic. I would say that, next to The Great Gatsby, it is the novel that encapsulates the 1920s, and it has a lot more bite than Fitzgerald's work. The joke, incidentally, isn't on Lorelei, but on the men who are daft enough to let her take them for a ride. So again, we have this total contradiction where she's feminist on one hand and then she turns around and takes it back. Now, luckily, the inspiration for the novel H.L. Mencken was able to see the funny side, and he announced that she was the first American writer to make fun of sex. He encouraged her to publish it, and it was first serialised in Harper's Bazaar, kind of like a prototype Bridget Jones' Diary, then as a book in 1926. On the day of its release, it was sold out completely by lunchtime, and by the end of the year, it was on its 17th printing. Loos then semi-retired for a few years, ostensibly to enjoy the spoils of her success, but in reality she spent most of her time tending to Emerson's non-existent illnesses at various pricey spas around Europe. In the late 20s, a doctor actually suggested that he put Emerson under anaesthetic, scratch his throat a bit, and then tell him he was all better. It was so bizarre that it worked, or at least temporarily. Now, according to Anita Loos, a biography, in 1931, when a combination of the Depression and Emerson's talent for spending meant that even the profits from Gentlemen Prefer Blondes had started to run dry, Emerson announced that one of us will have to go to work. And shock horror, Anita was contracted to MGM by Irving Thalberg for a staggering, bearing in mind this is the height of the Depression, $1,000 a week. She continued to work in Hollywood for another 15 years or so for MGM, most notably writing the pre-code smash The Red-Headed Woman and The Woman, both for MGM. She finally divorced Emerson in 1937, and then in 1946 she retired from Hollywood. She told Kevin Brownlow, next to D.W. Griffith, Thalberg was the greatest man in pictures. I was with him for 8 years, and when he died I said, Hollywood is finished, I'm going to get out. And I did. She moved to New York, where she spent the rest of her life writing plays and books, and apparently had an affair with Maurice Chevalier, which after 17 years of John Emerson, I kind of think she deserved. But frustratingly, her back and forth on feminism didn't stop. In an interview given in the 70s, she said of the kind of second wave women's lib movement, they keep getting on soapboxes and proclaiming that women are brighter than men. That's true, but it should be kept very quiet or it ruins the whole racket. In From Reverence to Rape, the treatment of women in the movies, Molly Haskell doesn't pull any punches when it comes to this deliberately non-threatening brand of feminism, saying, but it is precisely this kind of duplicity, the holy fallacy of women's inferiority that current feminists and yesteryear suffragettes challenge. For the Anita Loos flapper who wanted social and sexual rather than political and intellectual power, this was a gold-plated philosophy. As long as she played dumb, she could stay on her pedestal. And I feel as though a somewhat depressing pattern is beginning to emerge. We've got, on the one hand, our Mabel Normans, Julia Crawford-Ivors, and our Lois Webbers, who overtly challenged comfortable notions of femininity, either on or off screen, or both. Their careers all fell off a cliff when Hollywood started to legitimize itself around 1922. And then on the other, we've got the cool girls, Mary Pickford, Anita Loos, feminists who weren't feminists, who portrayed themselves publicly as less than they were. They're the ones who got to stick around. Now, of course, it's not a perfect theory. Frances Marion kind of had feet in both camps, and Anita Loos's talkie scripts certainly came up against the censors more than once. And then also, Carol Channing, who worked with her on the 1949 stage version of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, said that Loos didn't waste a great deal of time focusing on whether the men were happy with her or not. She just did what she knew needed to be done. So she wasn't exactly a doormat either, or at least not later in life. And this takes me back to where I started with this episode. Anita Loos is a bit of an enigma. And I go back and forth as to what extent she was playing the patriarchy's game and winning, or simply a complicated and somewhat contradictory personality. Maybe you've got a better handle on her than I do. I'd love to know what you think. Come and chat on Facebook at Hollywoodland the podcast, or feel free to drop me an email, claire@hollywoodlandseries.com. I really hope you enjoyed this episode on Anita Loos, and as always, any help in spreading the word about this podcast is a surefire way to find a place in my heart, whether you want it or not. Next week, we're going to throw a bit of a spanner into the works of any theories or patterns we might be developing and chat about a woman who just broke every mold going, the original Swedish siren, Greta Garbo. Thanks again, and see you next week.